Alright, my girls, so I wanted to go ahead and do a screencast of chapter 37. You do not need to read chapter 37 unless you want to. There's a couple slides in here where I put the page numbers on things that you might want to read more about, but again, you don't have to read it, and there's no reading guide to go with chapter 37. So just going to talk a little bit about things that plants need to grow. Some of you may be having flashbacks to fast plants and doing your note cards. But the first thing I want to talk about is the soil. And plants acquire their nutrition from two places, the air and the soil. The topsoil is the top part of the soil. That seems kind of silly to say out loud, but it is. And it's all the mineral particles that are released by weathering rock over the years, and humus. And the humus is the remains of any dead organisms that have died there, and their nutrients are just being released into the topsoil. The topsoil is the most important layer in terms of how plants are getting their nutrients. And it can vary in its thickness from a few millimeters to even meters thick, depending on where you are in the environment. Loams are the most fertile of topsoil, so if the topsoil is composed of equal parts sand, silt, and clay, then we call the topsoil a loam. And then the soil solution, which is soil with water mixed in from rain, or if you watered it, that's what's actually going to feed your plants. And the last thing on the slide about the soil is that the best soils are not going to have really large gaps between the particles of the soil, and they're also not going to have really, really tiny gaps. It's just going to be just enough to have a little bit of air and water in between those particles. If it was packed too tightly, then it would be difficult for things to pass through. But whenever it's just the right amount, that would be the best case scenario for the plant. So the topsoil is a term that encompasses all of the organic and inorganic components of the soil. It's not just talking about the organic or just talking about the inorganic, it's talking about all of the components. Some of the inorganic components would be things like nitrate, phosphate, sulfate, potassium, calcium, and magnesium. And you'll see in parentheses I have mentioned things about leaching. That's basically when it rains or you water a plant and anything is, in this case, like the nitrates, the phosphates, or the sulfates, but any components that are washed away by the water, that's called leaching. And then this process of cation exchange, I'm going to link a video in the note box, so when you're following along with this screencast, you can click the video and you can watch the video on cation exchange. But basically this is a process in which cations are going to be taken up from the soil by replacing the cations that are in the soil with some other cations. And if you remember, a cation is just a positively charged ion. So usually the cation that is going to replace the cations in the soil is hydrogen, because plants are really good at making a bunch of hydrogen ions through other processes that are occurring inside of the plant cells. But those hydrogens are usually swapped out for other cations that the cells of the plant need, like magnesium or potassium, or I'm trying to think some other ones like calcium, or all things that are all cations that could be exchanged. And the video that I'm linking is going to explain that. And then just here's a video. That's not a video, that is a picture. Here's a picture just kind of showing cation exchange. So the soil particles are negatively charged, as you can see, all these little negative charges that look like little Advils, actually. And you can see that they're holding on to things like potassium, calcium, and magnesium. However, the root hairs of the roots of the plant these root hairs, they're going to give off these hydrogens. So all these hydrogens that you see out here are coming from the root hairs, and those hydrogens are going to go pair with the negative charges in the soil, which will free up the other cations to enter into the cells. And again, the video that I'm going to link in that box on the last slide is a really, really good video that explains cation exchange. It's like 5 minutes long. Okay, so what are the organic components of the soil? That's going to be dead organisms, so the humus. And the more humus you have, the better your capacity for cation exchange. And it's also a reservoir of other mineral nutrients that the plant's going to need. So humus is really good for the soil, for the plants. Over time, as farmers plant, their crops and harvest their crops season after season after season, their fields are going to start to become less productive because all of the nutrients are being absorbed by all the plants that they're growing. And usually the crop fields are not going to have like animal waste or dead animals in them, usually. And so because of that, there's nothing to replenish the nutrients that the plants are absorbing. So the way farmers get around this problem is by using fertilizer. And I don't know how many of you help your parents like out in the flower beds. Maybe you didn't until like now that we're in our quarantine and our isolation. Maybe now your parents are doing some yard work and you're actually using fertilizers and stuff. But if you check, there's always like this little triangle box. Well, I guess it's not a box if it's a triangle, but there's always this triangle on your fertilizer packaging that says NPK. It's like I think it's like a blue, a red, and a white little triangle. And that's telling you the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that are in the fertilizer. And each of those values is supposed to be a certain level depending on what plant it is that you're trying to grow. But you always want to check out that NPK rating on your fertilizer. Some organic fertilizers would be like compost and manure. And the reason why I have organic in quotation marks here is because it's not organic in that it has like carbon and hydrogen. It's just that it's like natural, so to speak. So that's what the organic is for. But compost and manure aren't always the best to use. It's really great to get a commercial NPK fertilizer. But if you can't, but you have access to compost and manure, or whatever you're trying to grow grows really slowly, you could use compost and manure. But those are slow release because the nutrients inside of compost and manure usually have to be broken down before they can be used by the plant. So there's like additional steps that have to take place before the plant can actually use the nutrients. So essential elements for plants, these are all of the nutrients that if any are missing, then the plant is not going to grow appropriately. There are 17, sometimes 18 essential elements for plants. 9 out of those 17 are macronutrients, and that doesn't mean that they're big nutrients. It means that the nutrients are needed in large amounts. And 6 of those 9 macronutrients are the elements that are used to make the macromolecules. So cho-cho, chon, chomp, plus sulfur for some proteins. And then the other 3 are potassium, calcium, and magnesium. So all cations that are needed. And then 8 out of 17 of those essential elements are considered micronutrients, meaning the plant only needs them in small amounts. And that would be chlorine, iron, manganese, boron, zinc, copper, nickel, and molybdenum, which is my favorite one to say. And then I said sometimes 18. If you're talking about a plant that uses C4 or CAM photosynthesis, which we didn't really get to cover this year because I was absent for that because of Matt's accident. So I don't think Miss Messina covered too much CAM photosynthesis or C4 photosynthesis with you guys. But it's just some other techniques that plants can use if they're in like extreme or more extreme environments, like places that are really dry and really hot, like a desert, would use a different type of photosynthesis. If you want to learn about that, I'm sure you can just YouTube a video on it. But if a plant uses C4 or CAM photosynthesis, another essential requirement would be sodium. So some mutualism. So a mutualism is a type of relationship where two organisms are working together and both are getting benefits. And plants are going to live in tons of mutualistic relationships with fungi, bacteria, and sometimes even other like plants or humans, for example, that they'll live in this mutualistic relationship from. Obviously with humans, we take care of them, we protect them from pests and stuff like that. So they're benefiting because they get to grow and fertilize, or not fertilize, but reproduce. And we benefit because like we get to eat them, you know? But there's tons of mutualistic relationships. We're going to talk about a few of those. We're going to start with bacteria, and then we'll talk about some fungi. So rhizobacteria are bacteria that live in close association with plant roots, and the rhizobacteria were actually a topic of one of the FRQs from last year's Bio AP exam. So again, they're just bacteria that live in close association with plant roots. A rhizome is a part of a plant, so that's where that rhizo comes from with rhizobacteria. But the bacteria are going to benefit from all the metabolic processes of plants, so they're going to get like carbs, they're going to get amino acids, and they're going to get some organic acids from the plant. And then the plant is going to get the antibiotics that are secreted by the bacteria, so if there are any like other bacterial infections that could harm a plant, hopefully the antibiotics from the rhizobacteria will protect them. And sometimes the bacteria will also absorb toxic metals from the soil that would normally kill the plant, or they'll make nutrients more available to the roots. So one example of that is nitrogen that we're going to talk about in the next slide. So the nitrogen cycle, kind of like a little side note, because we're going to talk about the nitrogen cycle when we get to ecology. And I don't really think we've had a chance to talk much about the different types of nutrient cycling in honors the year I taught you guys. And I know like Allie, Catherine, and Stephanie, you guys didn't have me. So I don't know if you guys talked about the nitrogen cycle, water cycle, and all that. But we do need to talk about the nitrogen cycle so that we can talk about how bacteria help plants get nitrogen. So the nitrogen cycle is just the series of processes that are going to take place that are going to allow nitrogen-containing substances from the air and soil and make them useful for living things. And then they're going to be used by those living things, and then they're going to be returned to the air and the soil. So it's always cycling. Remember, law of conservation of matter. Nothing is created or destroyed. It's only reused and recycled. So a lack of nitrogen is a really big deal for plants. If a plant is going to have any type of nutrient deficiency, nitrogen is going to be the worst one. And think about all the things that need nitrogen that are super important, like DNA, nitrogen bases, and a lot of proteins are also going to use nitrogen. So if a plant doesn't have enough nitrogen, it's not going to be able to replicate its DNA. It's not going to be able to make RNA. It's not going to be able to make proteins because there's not enough nitrogen to build those things. So of all of the deficiencies, lack of nitrogen is the worst. Plants can only use nitrogen in two forms. They can use it in NO3, which is nitrate, or NH4, which is ammonium. So they can only use it in those two forms. But most of the nitrogen that plants use is going to come from that mutualistic relationship with the bacteria living in the soil, because most of the nitrogen that is out there is going to be in forms that can't be used by the plant, like plain nitrogen gas in the atmosphere. N2 has three bonds, so it has a triple bond. It's basically inert for the plant, so it can't use it in that form. And then the other form is like ammonia, and it can't be used either. It has to be ammonium or nitrate. So the bacteria are going to basically fix that nitrogen into forms that the plant can use. And I'm going to stop here. I have like 10 seconds left on the video, and I'll upload another screencast in just a second.